Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to start right on time because I want to make the most of our opportunity to be together. Welcome to the first in a four-part series that DRNY has put together to address the really pertinent issue of how to make the decisions around disclosing of non-obvious disabilities in the various settings in which we interact and live our lives. So that I want to tell you a little bit about where we're coming from and what motivated us to do this, a little bit about DRNY, and then I want to get down to it. Those of us at Disability Rights New York, which is New York State's protection and advocacy system for folks with all kinds of disabilities, were gathered a few weeks ago, and we realized that with September of 2021, some extraordinary things are going to be happening in all of our lives. And for folks with all kinds of disabilities, it is going to be a time when we're going to be making some transitions, and we need to think about how we're going to navigate those transitions in the context of our disabilities. And so we selected the situations that we thought would be of most value to people to learn about, and that would be starting with today's series about in the employment context. And then next week, we're going to move on to in the education context. The third week, we'll be talking about all things related to the COVID-19 experience and transition. And then the fourth, and I wanted to make this clear to everybody, is we wanted to set aside a very specific and special opportunity to address the questions that you all had, because we hate being on panels and attending panels where we don't have time to hear the answers to our questions in chat. So you can send them all along to us. I'm going to say this now and again at the end at disclosureqa@DRNY, and we will be incorporating them into the fourth session. So let me begin by saying I'm Mark Fleetner. I identify by the pronouns he, him, his. I am a middle-aged white male who's sitting with a jacket on today, just for you folks, in my home office, which is kind of a simple white wall. I'm wearing a black jacket, a blue jacket, a light blue shirt, and some kind of clear frame glasses, and I'm so glad to be with you. I'm the director of two programs at Disability Rights New York. The PAIR program, Protection and Advocacy for Individual Rights, which includes our work for folks with all kinds of physical disabilities, and the PAMI program, Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness, which helps us work with folks with all kinds of mental health diagnoses. And that's, of course, a significant segment of those that are now perhaps worrying about and planning for whether they want to disclose their non-obvious disability in the employment setting. And to be clear, we're talking not only about a current employment setting, but we're also talking about when you are in the process of obtaining employment and you're applying and you're meeting with folks on the other side of the table, or in recent times on the other side of the laptop. So these are really important questions that we want to get right down to. So I'm going to turn it right now to our first extraordinary panelist. Her name is Donna Walton, Dr. Donna Walton, and she is the president and the founder of the extraordinary Divas with Disabilities Project, which she'll tell us about. She's also the author of a really terrific book talking about her lived experiences, and it's entitled Shattered Dreams, Broken Pieces, A Journey of Faith, Resilience, and Reinvention. I'm sure that title speaks to so many of us before we begin. Can you just take it, Dr. Walton, and start to tell us a little bit about the organization that you've created and about its mission?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Donna Walton, and I'm an African-American woman with beige complexion. My hair is curly and it's styled today in a bun. I'm wearing silver earrings. I have on a green dress, and I'm sitting at my laptop, and behind me are array of artwork on my walls. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. A little bit about me. I'm an advocate, actor, and educator who also happens to be an above the knee left leg amputee. I also recently retired from the federal government, where I served in the capacity of a disability program manager and equal opportunity specialist. I hold a doctorate in rehabilitation counseling and leadership, and over the decades have applied this knowledge and experience and expertise to increasing employment outcomes for Black and Brown women with visible disabilities. And currently I am the founder, as Mark said, of the incredible organization, the Divas with Disabilities Project, which has the mission of amplifying the images and voices of Black and Brown women with visible disabilities to ensure that they are included and represented in the media, i.e. television, film, and advertising. We have several initiatives going on, and one of them mainly being, we got some funding to create a website specifically designed for LGBTQ people with disabilities for resources, because Divas, even though we, which stands for, I should say, dynamic, illuminating, victorious, achieving sisters, sisters being the emphasis for community, it's a community digital platform. But we recently got money to focus and to ensure that we are including LGBTQ individuals with disabilities. And so we're really excited about that, putting a website in place that will provide resources and a community of what goes on in film and TV if these individuals are interested in getting into that area.
Visibility is such an important aspect of what we're doing right now in all of our lives. And so I applaud you for taking the plunge and creating this organization.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Walton, I'm interested to know, going back probably a few years in your professional career, if you were faced with a searching decision as to whether you were going to disclose your non-obvious disability, presumably based upon what kind of clothing you're wearing or whether you're using a prosthetic. And what were, let's begin with talking about what were the concerns that were raised in your mind at the outset, and how did you process those?
Good questions. Well, first of all, to disclose or not to disclose, for me, it was always a decision, because my disability doesn't show up in an obvious way, if you will. I can walk into a room wearing my prosthesis, though I have a limp, I walk with a limp and a cane. It may not be necessary for me to disclose the fact that I'm an amputee at that moment. The situation will dictate when and where I disclose. So if I'm in the workplace, for example, I'll use the workplace for an example. I want to make sure, first of all, I sort of have some insight into what the policies and practices of that organization are. What's the culture of that organization? Have they been sort of compliant, if you will, with ensuring that individuals with disabilities are accommodated? So hopefully I'm in the right space when I show up to make that decision. It is also something that I observe before I get into the building. If I get into that, if I access a building and it's not accessible, it is more than likely I'm going to have to disclose the fact that I'm a person with a disability, because that is going to be, I need access. So I would definitely just have to disclose that. But there are other times, again, if I'm working from, I mean, if I in a personal or the community setting, I may not feel that it's necessary for me to disclose my disability. You know, it is a sometimes and depends situation, you know, a sometimes kind of answer, and it depends kind of answer on when and where you disclose. And it is a personal choice. But I think that the main thing you have to be concerned about is that you do not want to put yourself at risk by not disclosing when organizations are obligated to accommodate you.
Well, that raises an interesting question that I'm always addressing with clients and thinking about myself, and including with of course, our staff at DRNY, is The reality is that under the law, in order to be in a position to request and be granted reasonable accommodations, there has to be a disclosure of
Mhm,
the disability, and of course, a showing that the reasonable accommodation that one is seeking
mhm.
is going to allow the person to perform all the essential job functions if it is put in place. So yeah, so can you think of any particular times that you or anybody that you've worked with has been placed in a decision where that was a tough call?
Individuals with, I call them imperceptible disabilities, are always placed in that sort of precarious scenario, um, where they have to decide whether or not they're going to disclose that they have a psychiatric disability, whether or not they have an episodic disability. And I would think that so yes, I do have experience of individuals who have to really make that call. And they typically make it at the interview. Um, at the interview is the best time to make that judgment call. First of all, employers cannot say to you, I mean, just ask you, do you have a disability? But they can certainly say, is there something about this position, that you were starting on your first day that you would need that would make your day go easy, something like that. And then I think at that point, I think there's power and there's um, confidence, I guess, empowerment, I would say, in disclosing your disability. I do. So I would, the individuals that I have encountered, I've advised them to actually, I know that that's stigma, and I know that all the things that surround taking that chance, but I think that you're on the better side of the curve if you disclose the disability.
I agree with you. Did you have any unfortunate early career situations where there was an inability or an unwillingness of your employer or potential employer to accommodate your needs and appropriately address you as a person with a disability?
Well, that's really interesting because you think you and I had a conversation once about I had this wonderful opportunity to be a news reporter at a television station, and I actually came into that interview. Did very well on the writing and just the other aspects of the interview. But as soon as I walked into the interviewer's office, I was immediately, before I could even sit down, uh, discounted and share, basically discounted, saying that how would you run for to get the answers, to a story, given the fact,
Would
I've,
you be
I've
kind enough, and we don't need a whole chronology because I don't want to put you in that position, but at what when was that? How long ago was that?
well, that was pre ADA. It
Okay,
definitely was pre ADA.
okay.
But still, those situations have occurred post ADA, where you go into a room and you have I walk with the cane, like as I said, and I walk with the limb, and you're actually so you feel like you're on display when you walk into the office, and the
Right.
person's sitting there, and then they just sort of give you this, now when are you going to tell me what's wrong with you, so to speak. It's almost like, and they sort of hint around that. I've had persons make inappropriate comments. It seems like you had a bad weekend. It seems like what did you do? Did you beat somebody up? It's just inappropriate comments to let you know that self-disclosure right then, you're being discounted. And I think I want to also bring up the point too, Mark, is that as a Black woman with a disability, I live at the trifecta of discrimination. So being Black, female, disabled, and I really never know which of those markers are working against me in an interview. So I can walk into an office and I can be denied employment, and I sometimes don't know which of those I'm being denied. Am I being denied employment because I'm Black, because I'm female, or is it because of my disability?
I think that's such a good point, and unfortunately, we even have to take into consideration that it could be some combination of all three of those, and that's why it's so important that we empower ourselves wherever we can,
Absolutely.
in a situation where there's so much education that still needs to be done to the community at large.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. What we're going to do is we're going to keep moving through the panelists, but we're
Okay.
also going to engage you later on, and maybe we can all interface. I do feel responsible and proud to be able to say at this stage, before I turn the questioning over to a colleague of mine, a terrific PAMI staff attorney whose name is Sabina Khan, that I'm somebody who has a non-obvious disability. And it is only fairly recently that I have decided that the right thing for me to do is disclose it, because I haven't needed reasonable accommodations recently. But several years ago, in the context of, apropos to the work that you're doing, my coming out process as a gay man, I experienced some trauma that led to an organically based and an exacerbated depression with some anxiety. And I have found that it's my responsibility as a person with a disability to share that, not only for my own sake, but also for the sake of everybody else that's gathered here today, because it's all part of that cultural education process. So I don't want to
Great
take
point.
any more time with my story, but my lived experience, like all of ours, informs the work. So as I said, I am going to turn it over to my great colleague, Sabina Khan now, who's going to introduce you to our next panelist.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. My name is Sabina Khan. I'm a staff attorney here at DRNY's PAMI program. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I am currently sitting in front of a white wall. I'm a Pakistani American female with dark hair braided to my right side, and I too am wearing a jacket like Mark today, and I'm wearing a white shirt with an embroidered flower. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Philip T. Llanos. Professor Llanos is a clinical psychologist, a professor of psychology at John Jay College, associate editor for the journal Stigma and Health, and the author of Written Off: Mental Health Stigma and the Loss of Human Potential. Professor Llanos has devoted much of his career to studying issues related to mental health and stigma, particularly self-stigma, and the successful recovery and community participation of people diagnosed with severe mental illness. Welcome, Professor Llanos.
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction.
Absolutely. Could you start maybe by briefly sharing a general overview of your work, and if you don't mind, also sharing what clinical or lived experiences have inspired your research?
Sure, and let me just do the introduction as well for those who might not be able to see me, that I'm a middle-aged white Greek American male with brown hair sitting in front of windows in Midtown Manhattan, and I'm wearing a blue striped shirt. And so, so I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor here at John Jay at CUNY in Manhattan. I also work as a clinician for an agency called Services for the Underserved, also here in Manhattan. And since we're talking about disclosure, I do identify as somebody who has lived experience of mental health issues. I've definitely met criteria for social anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder in my life. I don't necessarily feel that my challenges have been of the status that I would consider them to be a disability, but I definitely have encountered, challenges in my life from them, and I've had to overcome them, and I've had to sort of get over this idea of being completely alienated and feeling fundamentally different from everyone else in society. So those are things that I've had to contend with and move on from. You asked me to talk about my work a little bit, so yeah. Let me just say, basically, I got into studying stigma because I'd been working as a clinician with people with who are service recipients for mental health problems, and I felt that it was something that was relatively not focused on, that the focus was primarily on symptoms and not really on discrimination that people were encountering, as well as the internalization of stigma, which I found to be a powerful force that needed more attention. So that's how I got into studying those issues as a researcher.
Thank you, Professor Llanos. And since we are talking about stigma today, it's really important that we define and understand what stigma means.
Mhm.
And one of the takeaways from your book is that stigma is not simply the process of discrediting what people do, but rather discrediting people themselves. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so a lot of time, the reason why I wanted to make that point is that sometimes when people are dismissive of a focus on stigma, especially in the mental health arena, they will sort of suggest that it's because of behavior that people engage in that might be upsetting to others. But what happens is when someone's been discredited because of negative stereotypes, then their future and past actions can be discounted based on them being viewed through this lens. And this creates a tremendous amount of anxiety in people who have a stigmatized condition, because they feel that their behavior is or can be under a microscope, right? And since we're talking about non-obvious, the word invisible is also used, in this field, but non-obvious disabilities like mental health conditions, if you haven't disclosed, then you experience this profound anxiety about will it be discovered, and how will all of the things that I've done and do be viewed through this lens. And so it's really important to understand that stigma is real, and it's not just what people have done that is causing it, but it's caused by the attachment of negative stereotypes to the label.
Thank you. And do you feel that internalized stigma or social stigma is the cause of the substantially diminished opportunities for individuals in the employment context when we're talking about participation within the community, vocational opportunities, et cetera?
That's a tough one. I can't tell you what's more important, but I can tell that they're both important, right? So yes, discrimination is real and it has a substantial impact despite the ADA, and the legal protections that people have. We do have evidence that it does occur. By the same token, many people avoid seeking work because of concern about stigma, and lack of employment exacts the cost as well, on self-esteem, on social relationships, on financial status, right? And it has a kind of a ripple effect throughout a person's life, and it impacts symptoms as well. So people who are employed generally, experience fewer symptoms if they're working in a supportive setting. So the important thing is to figure out ways to address both. So we want to address discrimination, we want to decrease it, and we need to do that through targeted efforts. But we also have to help people to figure out ways to disclose selectively and in a controlled, planful way, especially like Dr. Walton was talking about, which is really important, and come up with strategies to do that so they can get the accommodations that they deserve, and so that they can not avoid even trying to obtain work because of that fear. And I think that that's really important. So people need to have strategies for how they will explain, let's say, a gap in their resume that might have been because of hospitalization and things like that.
Yeah, and Dr. Walton, actually, she mentioned the word empowerment. Can you, from your research, from your clinical experience, tell us how you think people with mental illness can feel able and empowered to disclose their mental illness to employers, despite knowing that stigma exists?
Yeah, empowerment is tough because people say, talk about it, but you can't just give it to somebody, right? People have to find it on their own. I can definitely say, the term, as I grew to become familiar with it in the 1990s, came through the, what's now called the lived experience communities that I was engaged with, peer support, what was then called the consumer movement. right? And so people working with others and seeing their example, others who've been through what they're going through, and seeing their example can facilitate that process. But often it comes because someone has taken a chance and they've gotten that opportunity to see what happens when you speak up for yourself, right? So it's not something that we can just give to people by providing them with information, although that's a step in that direction. I think a lot of it is going to come through communities of support that people can share information, they can share tips, and they can share experiences. And when you're talking or you're hearing from somebody who's been through something similar to you, that can often help you to see yourself in that position and making a similar step forward. So that's how I sort of see empowerment operating. And I'm a little wary of the overuse of the term, I guess, because I know how sometimes these things become buzzwords and they get kind of drained of their initial meaning.
Right. And for employers, what role should they play? Why should they care about making the workplace a stigma-free zone?
Right. Well, it's because it's just and fair, right? Because mental illness is part of the human experience, and it probably affects employers too, right? If they're willing to admit it. And because also because you're losing, if you lock out or drive out people who have mental illness, you're losing their unique contributions and gifts, right? So I have a friend who is a very gifted worker in the museum field, and he has created really great exhibits, and he experienced a discrimination, and I think that was a real shame, and the loss, his employer that discriminated against him really lost out on his wonderful gifts and skills. So these are the types of things that employers have to be open to understanding that they lose out on if they lock out an entire group of people, which is very large in number.
So what can employers do to make the workplace, I guess, a stigma-free zone, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I think that we need to do more outreach to educate employers about how they can be more accommodating, right? Not just in name, but in deed, right? And learn about things like microaggressions, things that exclude people, right? So that's something that I think is more on us in the advocacy world to find out how to reach out to employers. And maybe we can start with the bigger employers, right? There's certain groups that employ very large numbers of people. I know in Scandinavia, I've been in touch with people there who involved with anti-stigma campaigns there, and so they started with H&M and IKEA, right? Those are the big employers, in those countries. So we have big employers here as well that we can start with. But yeah, we need to educate. They need to be aware of these, and then they need to I really think there's a role for like symbols here, right? So we have the rainbow flag as a sign of welcome for the LGBTQ community, and I think that we can find new symbols that can be adopted that can show that an employer is welcoming of the community of people with mental health issues as well. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's a lot of ways that we can very planfully do this as a society.
From your research, have you found that there's been progress in terms of destigmatization?
In the United States, unfortunately not. The data does not support that. There's a lot of reasons for that. But I think that there's evidence that progress can be made, right? So there was a successful, more than 10-year anti-stigma campaign in England that did show evidence of improvement, in reducing attitudes and behavior, in community members there. So I believe that we could do that here, and I'm hopeful still that it can happen.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Right.
All right, well, thank you, Professor Llanos. I am going to hand the mic back to Mark. I know we have one more panelist.
And
Excellent.
I want to say, I like to think we're starting it here. I like to think that some of the young Olympians who had the courage to do it are helping us start it, and particularly in the mental health context. And I also want to say on the mental health context, before we turn to John, who comes from a different but really fascinating perspective, that one thing we did at DRNY, and I'm going to put it out there because I think that maybe we can get a movement going here, is we inquired as to whether folks would be interested in a mental health sort of like support monthly meeting for those that were comfortable identifying as folks with mental health diagnoses or current mental health issues. The response was strong and was kind of like a nice number of folks. And in the first 2 meetings, and I'm particularly proud to say this is the director of the PAMI program for DONY, the kind of community that you referenced, Dr. Llanos, already started to form in a way that we hadn't formed as just members of the same organization that works out of 3 separate offices in the same state remotely at this moment. So we need to be creative about the ways that our employers help eliminate these things, and we need to pitch those ideas, I think, as part of our responsibility. So I'll leave it with that plug, and I'll turn to our other very esteemed colleague, John Robinson. Thank you for joining us, John. John is, I'm looking to make sure I've got the right titles, President and CEO. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, of a really incredible employer called Our Ability Incorporated. And when I say employer, I mean not only an employer, but a facilitator of employment. And so I'm really eager for you, John, to tell folks what the organization, Our Ability, is all about.
Thanks, Mark. Our Ability is an organization, it's a business. We started it 10 years ago, really solving a problem that I had a generation ago. And so somewhat similar to what Donna said, graduated Syracuse University with a degree in television, radio, film. I graduated in 1990, the same year the ADA was signed, and lived with people that went to the same communication school at Syracuse that I did. They all got jobs when they graduated, and big jobs. National Basketball Association, Newark, New Jersey's main daily newspaper, Golf Magazine. And I had the same GPA, the same internship, the same references and professors, and I was unemployed for 4.5 years. 3'9", quadruple amputee, no arms and no legs. You can't necessarily see that sitting down in my chair, but I'm 52 years old, sitting behind my desk in my office in downtown Albany as a quad amputee without the extension of my arms and my legs. White male, brush cut, haircut, sunburned face from golfing this morning. And, my pronouns are he and him. But that period of unemployment after Syracuse University forged everything that we do today. I had a good 16-year career in TV after being unemployed for 4 years, which was great. It afforded me a great life. Got married, had 3 children, nice income. And then something changed about 10 years ago. And the something changed was that I reflected upon being unemployed. A lot of companies would ask me to come speak about overcoming the obstacles that I overcame as a quad amputee and looking dramatically different. And so those speeches got bigger. But as the speeches got bigger, the visibility of people with disabilities in corporate America was obviously low. And so came home one day, went to my wife and said, hey, I want to start a company and I want to start it to empower people with disabilities. And we're going to do it because of my TV experience and telling stories. It didn't work that way. Like all small business, that's not what happens. What ended up happening in a roundabout way is today, as I sit here, we have an artificial intelligence driven Microsoft Azure built system where individuals with disabilities around the world can sign into our system, speak to a chatbot, engage with a chatbot, talk about their skills, their ability, where they live, what they're looking to do. And then we have a jobs board. So over the past 10 years, we've gotten to know many corporations around the country. We have a jobs board today at ourability.jobs that publicly anybody can go find. We have 71 companies that we work with throughout our regional partnerships and ourselves. We have over 64,000 jobs right now. And so inside our artificial intelligence engine, Mark, you can fill out your profile, you can tell us who you are, you can answer the skill assessment questions, put in your past history and your future interests, and it's going to call through the 64,000 jobs right now and make recommendations for you today of existing jobs that are available. And we are, so you ask what our ability is, it's a lot of things because it came from a long process. But right now we are a platform that is beginning to grow around the world. We have 7 regional partnerships in North America. We've been invited by Microsoft to build further upon it. We are working with other disabilities providers internationally, all trying to build this little thing that will help empower people with disabilities and show businesses that we have the ability to do a job. In that journey of being unemployed, in the journey of trying to go work in the media world, I realized if I could have removed the bias of my disability, if I could have shown my ability to sell advertising at a neutral level, that I wouldn't have been unemployed for 4.5 years. And so that's what our system is doing. So the t-shirt I'm wearing is Jobsability, the coffee cup that I'm drinking water out of, Jobsability. The system that we built over the past 4 years here with our ability is called Jobsability. It's because we all have the ability to do a job.
Well, thank you. Thank you, all 3 of you. I'm sure everybody here can tell how your work is really addressing exactly what we're here to discuss. And we couldn't be more grateful. Now, John, I'm going to take you back, if you would indulge me, to those darker times that were your motivators. So you're up for a job and you're going through the screening process. You've applied for a job and you're going through the screening process. How did you go about, and what were your experiences in terms of disclosing at that application stage, so that we can inform each other?
Yeah, I mean, we have to harken back to letters and licking envelopes and resumes and sending them out the door. And I sent hundreds of resumes to way too many television radio stations, from Montreal to Washington, D.C. and Chicago to Boston. Early on, I was ignorant in that disability shouldn't matter. So I avoided it until I got to the first interview. That was a mistake. And so then eventually I addressed it in the letter that, I'm a person with a disability. I guess at that point I called myself disabled, that I was an amputee and that I drove a Honda Civic so I could get around, i.e. telling sales managers that I could get to my appointments. Even that didn't help. And so, it was a whole lot of perseverance, realizing that in that 4.5 years, some things changed. In that 4.5 years, I had to let go of the anger that I had about, people discriminating. And I just had to, like sales, and really this does come down to sales 101, every no leads to a yes. And so I just had to keep interviewing, keep going. I had 25-second interviews in person, trying to tie my tie and tuck in my shirt, and struggling with that part of it. Now you can't say that in an interview, right? You can't say, hey, do you realize what I went through to just get here? And so if I do that, I can go sell advertising on a TV station. But eventually, there was a sales manager, ironically in Syracuse, New York, where I went to college, who realized that. And he said that to me. He said, I can see what you've overcome to do this, then selling advertising is going to be easy. But he gave me a test. He said, hey, sell me my coffee cup. Sell me my coffee cup. So if you're selling coffee cups, what is it why buy my coffee cup? And I asked him a whole bunch of questions about the coffee that he drank. I didn't talk about the cup at all. And he liked that. And so, thank goodness, because then that started that career. But it was a big learning journey on my part you fast forward to our ability and jobs ability. The reason why we take people with disabilities through the questions, it's a big part of learning who we are. In today, 2021, hey, businesses are better about being inclusive. So I wouldn't be unemployed today for 4.5 years if I were 22 now. But you know what? We're in a different place today, and so I reflect back on that. So I'm glad to be here today.
I wish we were in as different a place as you sort of described, but the reality is that sometimes, and this is my plug for whatever protection and advocacy system it applies in your state, is that we're here to help you if you are discriminated against in some of these blatant ways that John's referencing. Now, I'm going to ask you this question, John, but then maybe turn to our other panelists as well. I think it was Philip that mentioned the disclosing in a controlled, planned way. Now, as a lawyer, I advise our clients that controlled, planned way includes what is the system that was created by the employer for you to disclose, right? Like, make sure you follow the proper protocol so they can't disregard your accommodation using that as an excuse. But when you think of controlled and planned disclosure of disabilities, what are the things that you think about?
Well, I think there's two things. There's obviously visible and invisible disabilities. Obviously my disability is obvious, so disclosing my disability to my employer was pretty easy. Obviously I need a step stool to be able to reach the photocopy machine. I need a step stool to reach the toilet and the washroom basin, right? So disclosing that was evident. But the journey of doing that on paper was the struggle. As we work with businesses now, because now we're on the other side, we're working with KeyBank and M&T Bank and Price Chopper and Ally Bank and Lowe's Home Improvement, Microsoft. The disclosure needs to be available and systematic and neutral and private to some degree, right? That when I need to be comfortable in doing this. There needs to be a system in place to do it that is comfortable, so that the accommodation can be triggered if needed. And I can't feel uncomfortable, and I can't be put pressure on. And so we walk businesses through that. And I'm looking at Maya's response to me saying I would still be unemployed for 4.5 years. I will disagree with that vehemently. We are in a better place with the businesses. Are we perfect? No. Are the businesses perfect? No. But you know what? Businesses are much, much better than they were in 1990 to 1984. And we have to understand that. And the reason I say it that way is you look around, wherever you live, wherever you work, wherever you are, you look right now, every business has a help wanted ad out. Every one, right? Every business needs people. This is the opportunity to present candidates that can be successful. As both other panelists mentioned, ways to educate businesses on disability, come together to some understanding that if you consider individuals with disabilities employment, it will improve your bottom line. And those help wanted signs that are in your windows will come down if you listen to us and others. I think we're in a better place than we ever were. We still have a lot more work to do. And I think some of that work now is within our own disability community. That it's time for us to stand up as much as we ask the businesses to stand with. We have to put ourselves out there. We have to show our skills. We have to ask for the job. And we have to understand that this is a very real situation amongst two parties. I do look dramatically different when I walk in the door. I can't change that. And so does that mean there'll be a double take? Yeah, it does. And so we have to come to that understanding.
Thanks. Dr. Walton, I'm going to sort of turn to you with the same question because you're definitely coming at it from a different lens. Controlled, planned disclosure. What has that meant for you in your life or in the lives of those that you've interfaced with about this issue?
Well, when John was speaking, I was thinking of several things. I was thinking that it is a very strategic action with regard to disclosure. And what is really important about it is that, I think even Philip talked about it, that while empowerment is this sort of fuzzy, cannot wrap your sort of definition around it, there are three things that are really critical about empowerment that I think is sort of a precursor for disclosure. And that is, self-actualization, self-efficacy, and self-awareness. And I think that it's a 50-50 split, that with employers, they have the responsibility, as John said, as much as persons with disabilities. We share that responsibility. And the more informed persons with disabilities are, the more advocacy. It's not an easy walk. I by no means minimize that it's just about showing up, being empowered, all those terms that we hear that are supposed to be inspiring. But what is really the true point of the matter is that if we do not, as persons with disabilities, if we do not take a stand and knock down that door as many times as we have to, then I think that we stay behind the door. And then we don't hold employers accountable at all. Yes, it is becoming inclusivity is becoming a little more open. Employers are becoming a little more informed and educated. But it should be that you shouldn't have to really think about it as much. Disability is a human experience. John should be able to walk into an office as an amputee, I could decide to take off my limb that day. I don't have to wear my leg. You want to just be able to move through society without having to think of all of these strategic, ways of how am I going to get a job? Will I be denied? What are the perceptions behind this door? That's a lot to manage as a person with a disability. And we do that every day.
Yeah, we do.
But it's what's critical though, is that we cannot give up doing that. And you have to even become more radical at becoming self-advocates. I mean, self-advocacy is really where our power lies. And just having a game plan of how, and when what is your goal? If your goal is to get employed, then you better know your laws. You better know a lot about that employer, and you have to be ready to fight.
I mentioned the fact that it's our obligation to understand the processes that have been set forth by the employer, right? So that we get those right. Does it also help to educate and come up with ideas sort of affirmatively before the conversation begins about the reasonable accommodations that you will need? I would think that taking, for example, your lived experience where this ridiculous statement was made that you won't be able to run after somebody to get the story like somebody else, I would think that if we were prepared for those kinds of ignorant approaches with some education, that it might be a good strategic part of the strategic plan.
Yeah, I mean, getting to know getting to know your interviewer is really important too. I mean, I one of the sort of I guess strategies I've used is knowing who is interviewing me, knowing something about their family, where they go to school. Really having information about people is really important because it allows you to have a window, sort of a cheat, a sort of an inside view of what their life has been. I really believe that we're on this journey and that, at some point in our lives, someone will have experience with disability, whether it's with a family member or, we're just always in one step away, if you will, from becoming a person with a disability. So I think having this understanding of the human, of that they are humans and they have a human experience, and you tap into that. You know, I always feel like the matters of the heart sometimes is where we're dealing with attitudinal issues, and they're always the most difficult to challenge and to change. But that's where actually where the change is going to have to come, because we see that we have laws and, you know, we have mandates, and we still have high discrimination and unemployment rates, discriminated against persons with disabilities. So that ain't working very well. So, you know, I just think to take the different approach and understanding who's behind the curtain.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. It makes me think immediately of John, because John on paper and John speaking to us as he just did is a very, very different person, if you will, right? And if you're finding a potential employer who and a specific interviewee who is you think will be the kind of person that will get that, then you can make the most of it. Yeah. Phil, do you have any particular input on this issue that I'm describing in terms of the planning, the strategy, that kind of thing?
I don't have anything to add beyond what was discussed. I did want to add something about this idea of people with disabilities getting into positions of power, and that hopefully being something that can turn things around. And I know it's hard and it's a lot of pressure for some to kind of experience, but I think that does make a difference. And I think that getting into these positions of power can really start to change some of these practices. And I've often found myself, again, I'm not necessarily identifying as a person with disability, despite what I disclosed, but I've often found myself being the advocate, you know, in the room, you know, with faculty and other settings, and coming into conflict because of that, but having to be taking that as a responsibility. I have to be the one to stand up, you know, against discrimination and the like.
That's a good
Well,
point. I'm with.
Oh,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, please. Dr.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Thanks, Philip, for bringing that up about being at the table. I mean, the change really comes from you know, people with disabilities having the power to make that change. And sometimes that can only happen if we're in the room. And so that's one of the things we're doing at the Divas with Disabilities Project, is that we encourage individuals to not always go after for those roles, you know, being an actor, but also looking to work behind the camera, being you know, the showrunner, you know, being the director, being the producer, so that you can have more say in how change really takes place.
Yeah, I'm interested to know any of your thoughts. I was thinking that Philip's perspective from this exclusively mental health perspective would be valuable about the culture that where you are choosing to apply for a job, or the culture where you have made the decision or making the decision whether or not to accept the position. How much does that come into play for folks with mental health diagnoses, or should it?
I mean, I think it's really important. I think it's hard to read initially, right? You know, we know, you know, there's some places that have a very abusive, non-supportive culture, right? You know, that's not a great environment for anybody, but it's certainly not a great environment to be in if you are sensitive to criticism and things like that, and the kinds of jokes that might be made in that setting are gonna lead you to feel like excluded and unwelcome. And so I think that getting a sense of that is really important. And I don't know tried and true ways to do that, but you know, I can certainly say I've always tried to read that when I've applied to places, and I often had a sense like, this is not the place for me. You know, I do need to look somewhere else, because this is not going to be a place where I'm going to feel welcome, you know, as somebody who believes in the things that I believe in and has the types of experiences I've had.
And John, for you, particularly since you are bringing together employers and employees, what are your thoughts about the culture, and what do you see in the businesses that you're working with these days in that regard?
Yeah, those businesses that embrace the culture are the places that I want to work and I want to place people. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, um, when it was said before that we need to be included in leadership, we need to be included in senior positions. You look no further than Microsoft, who we have a close relationship with, who has a chief accessibility officer. Products, services, employment, and outreach include people with disabilities in every instance. And that's no surprise. And also, if you watch their stock price, it's skyrocketed since they've done that. So there's a business case, there's a monetary case, there's an employment case, and there's a real societal case. Then let's transpose that for a second. Microsoft asks us, because we're here in New York, why won't New York State and the governor's office have a chief accessibility officer? Because the former governor, now I can say that, didn't care about people with disabilities. So now we will see with Governor Hochul, soon to be, we'll see if the people with disabilities are included in leadership. We in New York better demand it, right? We demand it from the businesses that we're going to go work at. We demand it from products and services. We want to talk about accommodation that we may need to be successful. But if we don't get leadership positions in government, this will never occur. Why does it matter beyond just having a chief accessibility officer, which would trickle down to everything in New York? Let me give you a practical example. If you ask people with disabilities if they want to work, the answer is yes. You ask them what our hurdles are, Social Security disability benefits become number one. If you have people with disabilities in government positions voting on this, SSDI would not be a barrier to employment. It would be a lift up to employment. You wouldn't lose it when you get a job. It would be a support in getting a job. We have to demand we're included in leadership in all positions. And it's not me that's saying that. It's one of the biggest corporations in the world asking me why this state doesn't do it. I'm just the conduit. And those are very practical examples of why being involved and seeing myself somewhere is where I want to go work and play and pray and get entertainment, right? That's inclusive. Inclusivity is so important.
A lot of consistent themes coming up here, and I hope we all leave and process them. We've got 3 minutes to our countdown. I want to, starting with you, John, and working to the others, what is the single best way that someone who's heard you speak today and wants to know more about your work can find you?
The best way is come to ourability.com. Contact us if you'd like more information. If you are a person with a disability or you know people with disabilities that are looking for work, sign into the portal. Like I said, it's growing worldwide, which is great. Obviously, our roots are here in New York, so that's cool. I'm a pretty public person. There's been a documentary on PBS. I wrote a book. You can't not find me if you want to. If you want to follow us on Twitter, that's great. You can see my hockey ramblings in the middle of the winter. The rest of it's mostly normal. But I'm a public person, but the website is the place to start and let people know it.
Thanks. Dr. Walton, what's your answer to that question?
Absolutely. If you're interested in the work that I've been doing around disability inclusion and in Hollywood, you can go to donnawalton.com. If you're interested in the Divas with Disabilities project specifically, you can go to divaswithdisabilities.org. And hey, we're looking for volunteers all the time. And we love to have you. We're looking for allies. And last but certainly not least, if you are interested in participating in any of our programs, you may also contact the Divas with Disabilities, www.divaswithdisabilities.org.
Awesome. How about you, Phil, and John Jay, College of Criminal Justice?
I just encourage people to seek out opportunities to get involved in advocacy and peer support and self-education. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out and I'll try to direct you to things that are happening in your area. and there's a lot of great resources that are unfortunately not used as much as they could be. So we have some great organizations in New York City like Baltic Street AEH and support groups at NAMI NYC Metro, and these are organizations that are underused and could be used a lot more, and people would get a lot more opportunity to draw on those resources.
Cannot thank you three enough. Cannot thank all of you who tuned in for this conversation. We look forward to continuing next week at the exact same time. Again, education is the topic. Wanted to quickly state that with about a week's lag time to do the technology, these have been recorded. They will be up on our website and they will be up on our YouTube channel. Please make other folks aware of that. And also reminded folks that our fourth and final in the series is going to be devoted to your questions and your comments. And so again, disclosureqa@drny.org. Thank you, everybody. Have a good, safe rest of the day. And again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.